So this is the beginning, in a way, of part 4 of the day. You've just all come back from one breakout room, and I kind of posed the question to the group of, based on the understanding that in our power role as counsellors, as CEOs, we hold power because of those titles. Therefore, with that power, what privileges come along with that role and that power? So I'm interested to hear from the group then. What thoughts did you have? Any ideas of what privileges? And anyone can start or jump in.
Tricky, actually, in some aspects. Debs was say, well, I'll let you explain, Debs, what your kind of dilemma was, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I was struggling to sort of see how I could ever not be in a relationship of power imbalance because of my position.
Yeah.
And then because I have a responsibility primarily to the service users as a group, will mean that I have to put restrictions on individual people's experience of our service, because I have to protect the group and I have to protect the organisation. So I mean by that we have 2 offers of counselling. It's either 12 sessions or 24 sessions, and you get one of those 2 things.
Okay.
And there is no kind of negotiation within that. And that is done because that enables us to see more people. There's reasons behind that, but what it means is that there's no power from the service user's point of view over, unless they decide to have less sessions, there's no power over how many sessions they can have, or what the offer might look like in that way. But I would struggle to know how there could ever be an equal relationship, because I'm always going to have to make decisions that restrict people's experience on an individual level to kind of protect the whole.
Okay. Yes.
So that's
no, I completely understand. And it's an interesting one, because I have a couple of thoughts with that, which is absolutely in your role, you hold a power that will dictate and influence then service users' experience of the service. When we go on to the slide that I have with a list of privileges on them, I'm wondering then whether we can maybe slightly shift how we view those privileges to, it's not necessarily, how can I put it, it's not about getting rid of the privilege. It's about ensuring then that privilege perhaps is explicit or is known, therefore we can be more transparent about it.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of brought back in the group, was that if there's not a way of removing the privilege, how do you be transparent about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm glad the group kind of were thinking then about recognizing that, this is not about, just like we have privileges out there or with other aspects of our identity, it's not about necessarily us being able to remove the privilege, but can we acknowledge that, I don't have hurdles? Can I acknowledge that, I've got a flat, smooth surface rate, 100-meter dash, and you have hurdles? So, I'm glad the group kind of were able to kind of move towards that thinking. Yeah. Were you able, between the group here, I'm not asking just you specifically, Deborah, so any other thoughts on any other, on any types of, or in which, sorry, I'm saying it in the right way, any particular privileges that you hold or experience or have as counsellors or CEOs?
I was just starting to say, as we were coming towards the end of the session, perhaps it could be, and this could be perceived, but a privilege of being in a well place. So a client comes to us perhaps in distress, and their perception is that we, as counsellors, perhaps have it all together and
we're sorted.
We're okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that we are on the other side because we are the one giving the service as opposed to receiving it, that we therefore must be absolutely projected onto us, but that we are well enough and that we are well. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a really good one to name and acknowledge. Yeah. Because of course that's not always true. We're human first, and we all hold hidden, invisible, if not visible, distresses or difficulties, or we each have our own mental health or other disabilities that mean that we are not or assumed to be well. Yeah. Yeah, really important one there. Yeah. Any others?
I was saying something about having privilege in terms of the narratives about the client. So like what we choose to take to supervision about them, what we choose to document in case notes. I've seen it play out in some settings where it could be like what I write like wrongly carries more weight than what the client themselves directly says, and it's something to watch out for. It's like like an epistemic privilege, basically. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. That we become kind of a filter for what gets shared with us and what we then choose to do within. Which bit do we deem important enough to take to supervision or not, or equally what we deem as not good enough or important enough to take to supervision, and absolutely what we do or don't write in our notes. Maybe what we do or don't deem as a safeguarding issue. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that has the power to then shape perceptions of how that person is, who they are. Yes. And sometimes that can be out of our control as well, like in the situation if it was like a court order or something. And yeah, and then I don't know, I was trying to think about ways in which you could try and flatten that. So like trying to do notes collaboratively with people checking out your understanding, but then there's things like time constraints and whether the person wants to do that too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Really like, hold on to all of these thoughts about where we hold this privilege, because again, it's about how do we then work with it, as opposed to we can't get rid of it. Well, we have to do our notes, we have to take clients to supervision. But again, I think it's about making it really conscious then. It's so much of an internal process being an anti-oppressive practitioner, because it's us constantly checking out with ourselves. What is it that I'm filtering? What is it that I'm excluding or including? What am I choosing to give greater weight to or greater importance to? With all of those things, in terms of what they disclose, what we take to supervision, what we write in our notes, what we deem as a safeguarding issue, for example. Yeah, absolutely. So I have a bit of a list myself. So let me bring that up. So based on this idea that because we're in a power, we have a role power, and because we have power in our role as counsellors or CEOs, that absolutely brings with it privileges. So these, again, the interesting thing about privileges is, as we said earlier, they're hidden, they're nuanced, they're subtle. We don't always realise that they are actual privileges. So once I say some of these, they might be a little bit like a Homer Simpson dot moment of, oh my goodness, of course. Because even when I was coming up with this list, I mean, this is again taken from the book and taken from that material, but when writing the book, I was like, actually, so much of what we do in counselling is born out of us being familiar with it. Okay, so at the very top of my list is familiarity. The very fact that as counsellors, we are familiar with, have knowledge of, have experience of, and familiar of the counselling culture, the process, therapeutic relationship, of what actually happens in the room, of what I might call the emergent process of talk therapy, that we absolutely hold a privilege that we are familiar with all of that. That's, in a way, counselling as a culture. That becomes, we are normative within the counselling space. Yeah. If we're not aware that that's a privilege, we see it as normative, that, oh, this is just me and what I do, and you, the client, just need to adapt to it, or you just need to kind of get up to speed with it. It's a bit like we spoke about the TV shows earlier, the idea of Friends, and that's inclusive to everyone. So it should be relatable to everybody, and everybody should feel included and represented and should feel that they can access this. So there's something here for me in which, because as counsellors or in training or working in the profession as CEO or in a service or managing a service, the actual work itself is familiar to us, and that is a privilege. Because what do we say so often about clients coming to counselling? Majority of clients in coming to counselling, it will be their first ever experience of being in counselling in the space, in that process. So let's not overlook what might feel now like quite obvious, that, yeah, of course, clients, we shouldn't expect clients to be au fait with and familiar with the process itself. Of course, then a counsellor also has privilege over control, and that can include things of, we control the counselling itself, linking into, we hold the boundaries or therapeutic frame, we control the environment itself with the chairs, and clients come into our territory, quote unquote. Yeah. So the level of control we hold as counsellors, because of everything that's happening in the room, we hold the control around, if environmentally, the room, maybe where we choose to sit, where the client sits, but also we can control in terms of, if not assigned number of sessions, we can certainly control the number of sessions we can offer and be available to our clients. We can control if a session's happening next week or not. We can turn around and go, I'm away next week. So we hold control in all these different aspects of culture, process, and actual experience within the room. In terms of feedback, we sit with the ability to give feedback to our clients and comment on their narrative. As opposed to the way around, the client may give us feedback, or in a review might be able to tell us how well they think we're working together, but they're not commenting on who we are, or they're not commenting on our lived experience or our narrative. So we hold a privilege to sit in a position in which part of our role is to give feedback, is to reflect, to give comment, to point something out, to offer interventions, however you want to identify with that through your particular modality. But we offer something in return of the client sharing with us. We, of course, have the privilege of the boundary of self-disclosure. Now, we can sit there and learn everything we want about our client, but in return, though, they do not know everything about us. And I appreciate where we each hold that boundary of self-disclosure is also a privilege for us as well. For some of us, and again, I appreciate that's dependent on modality as well, but we might use self-disclosure in very particular ways, but where we choose to hold the boundary around it is a privilege for us. And as I've mentioned, holding the boundary itself is, we have both the experience, knowledge, and the responsibility to hold boundaries, and that includes endings as well. So for us to say, right, we're coming to time, or I'm mindful that we've only got a minute left of the session, and we hold those boundaries, or no, only, because I'm psychodynamic in my core training, the idea that 50-minute session weekly, same day, same time. Like, the client, if they choose to turn around and go, well, no, Myra, I want 2 sessions a week, or Myra, I want shorter sessions or longer sessions, I'm going, that's, I hold the power to determine what that will look like or not look like. We mentioned credibility throughout today as well. I'm automatically given credibility. In that status, I'm automatically given credibility because I'm the counsellor in this helping relationship. We mentioned language and the use of language. So not only do I hold influence through my language and what I give back in my feedback, but also I have knowledge and experience of professional language. So I can sit there and talk about, not specifically with a client, but if I wanted to, and if I wasn't aware of the power, I could use a whole load of therapy jargon to impress my client, or to dominate and have power over my client, or to shame my client. No, if I'm not careful with that privilege in language, I can utilize it as power over. And more generally, in influence, of course, we hold weight and we hold knowledge about our client. So we hold a position of influence over our client because we have that role power. So what we say is taken with great weight by clients, and we may not always be aware of how, in what way, or in how much, essentially, something we might say, how much it might land with them, and the weight that they're going to attribute to that. I don't know about any of you, but if you've ever been in a session and a client goes, Myra, that thing you said really resonated with me, or the thing you said last week really resonated with me. I have this moment of panic of going, oh my God, what did I say? Like, what was the bit? And 9 times out of 10, it will be something that in that moment I didn't think was anything spectacular or a major, penny dropping moment. It will be some bit of feedback or reflection, but because it landed with them, they've attributed a huge amount of weight to that one thing that I've said. So we just got to be really mindful or recognize that what we say will hold influence. And of course, we hold a huge amount of responsibilities as the counsellor. We hold legal, ethical, safeguarding responsibilities, but then we also hold the responsibilities of all of these other things on this list. Boundaries, we hold responsibility for not only holding those boundaries, but managing boundaries. We hold the responsibility of controlling the sessions. We hold and things like contracting. We hold the client to the therapeutic frame. So we hold a huge amount of responsibility. We're managing. Part of our job is to take responsibility for the work. And of course, then payment. If we are in a position in which we're being paid. Now, what I want to kind of say about that, whether the counsellor is being paid directly or whether in a service or charity or agency, wherever there is any payment taking place, the client is paying us. And so by being paid, it sets up a power imbalance. So whether they are in a charity and paying the charity directly, whether it's donation based, whether it's set fee, or whether they're paying the counsellor directly because it's a private practice, we are being paid to be there and to do that job. I always say that, of course, there's a difference between being paid in the job, but we don't get paid to care. There's something about our care and our empathy and who we are and how we show up. We do that because that's the job, not because, and why we want to perhaps train as counsellors, not because, well, I'm being paid, well, now all of a sudden for the next 50 minutes, I'm going to turn into some kind of generous, empathic, caring person, and the rest of the week I'm a really horrible person. But the payment there, though, is it sets up a dynamic with clients that can feel like, because you're being paid, how might the client feel about paying in order for what they might perceive as, well, I'm paying for you to be kind, I'm paying for this time with you. So I think it holds, we have the privilege that we get paid for the work if we are in a position that we directly get paid for it. So just thinking through here a number of, subtle, nuanced privileges that we hold because we have role power. Okay. Just going to stop sharing and come back to the group. Just any thoughts, reflections on that before we move on? And does anything on there surprise you or stand out, or perhaps we're naming something that was, again, subtle, but now we're just making it explicit?
I guess the only thing that comes out for me is I'm surprised that you've put responsibility there as a privilege, because I would usually think of that as I don't know, like a weight rather than
Yes.
a privilege. So
Yeah.
it's interesting that that's included in there.
The reason it's really good shout, actually, because the reason I include it is because we hold the responsibility of it. We can, if we're not careful, decide what happens with it. So, for example, like if we think about like a safeguarding issue, because I hold responsibility to reporting safeguarding, all of a sudden now then I have power over my client to determine what do I what's deemed as a safeguarding issue and I can report it, or what do I think is not that important. Yeah. So it's not, how can I put it? So it's not about having the responsibility, it's how am I utilizing my power of what I do with the responsibility. But this is very subtle shift, isn't it, between absolutely, responsibility feels like, oh, it's a weight, it's a burden, but the moment you have the responsibility, actually you hold a power with it, you hold a control over it, and that's where power over can creep in if we're not careful. But no, lovely shout out for that, just so that we can distinguish between the two. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on to the final bit? No? Okay. So where are we at? Oh, just over 20 minutes left of today. So what I want to introduce you to then, again, we're thinking about, so how do we now recognize that in holding those different types of power, role power, historical power, societal power, and recognizing that if we're not careful, we can, because our role power comes with all of these privileges that we've just identified, how can we then recognize or identify ways to rebalance the power, flatten the power? So we're going to have a look at that in a moment. I'm just going to, let me just find it on my slide deck. So bring up the right one. Where, for me, where we're going to kind of culminate this all together as we're doing kind of in this last section is, oh, that one, let me make sure I get the right one, is, I go to that first and I'll go on to the slide. So as we've thought about already, that's those scales of power, where for ourselves, for our societal power, we can have things that increase our power, things that decrease our power. In those arrows, we can now add in all of these privileges that might increase our power. So does that make sense? So you know that the two arrows that we had, the increase power and decrease power, we can now add into the arrow pointing up for ourselves, our role power that comes with this list. Yeah. So we can start to see that actually, even if we have a lot of identities that are oppressed and decrease power, actually our role power carries all of these privileges with it. So this entire list and role power can go into our increased power diagram. If you made that earlier, you can add this into that increased power, because that very neatly brings us onto putting the two arrows together, the arrow that's for us and the one that represents the client or supervisee. Because the moment we've identified what increases our power and decreases our power, we can then start to do that for our client, and we can put them side by side. Is everyone with me on this? Yeah, because we've already filled in the arrow, the scales of power for ourselves. The moment we fill out the scales of power for our client, so we've then got two different scales of power, we can put them side by side, and that brings us to this, which is scales of relational power. Yeah, because what we're doing is we can see them in relationship to each other. We can see how filled up each of these four arrows are. So what increases my power as the counsellor and what decreases my power, but also for the client, what increases their power and what decreases their power. Okay, is everyone with me in terms of we're bringing the two arrows together? Yeah, so we fill out scales of power. We're filling out the scales of power for ourselves. We can fill out the scales of power for a client or supervisee or student or whoever else we're in relationship with, and then in this tool we're bringing it together for us to be able to identify scales of relational power. Yeah, and I always find, again, this is a template of, by having the slide deck on Monday, it's a PDF, you can obviously print this out as your template, but it is in the book as well. So if anyone does have the book, there are templates in the back of the book that you can photocopy. But again, for me, this is a really useful tool to have in your kind of bag, essentially, so that as you're filling it out in your process notes or taking it to supervision, it's a very visual aid to be able to start identifying where power is, between, as I was talking earlier, between me and my client. What might push me up and them down, or equally what might push me down and them up. So this for me is a very useful way to bring that all together. Okay. Any thoughts on this before we move on? As I said, it's just a very, so I'm very visual. These type of tools for me just work. And I don't, it sounds a bit weird, but I don't have to think too much, because the diagram helps me to navigate where it needs to go on the diagram. So it's doing the work for me. I don't need to think about it afterwards. The arrows very clearly tell me then what that weighting might be. Any questions or thoughts on this?
I just wanted to hear
Shubnam, yeah.
how doing it, how that would help me really work with the client and the supervisor and the student as well,
Yes.
because it's quite explicit, isn't it? So you putting your own sort of increased power and decreased power sort of privileged identities in there, and then the clients or the, you know, or the students or even
Student, yeah.
supervisees.
Yeah.
I can almost immediately see what is happening right in front of me,
Yes.
and then that will then help me be able to relate actually in a non-oppressive way. Because like you said before, I mean, with the responsibilities and how could that could be a power and privilege. And yes, especially when it comes to safeguarding, you know, everyone takes a responsibility so seriously, but actually that could be a huge power imbalance. And
Yes.
for me, and you know, to be able to bring that into sort of the context of dealing with students or dealing with supervisees or dealing with clients, that could be a very clear way of how what's happening in the relationship and actually how we can move forward with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just prompted me to think of a few examples, because of course it's not just the responsibilities of legal, ethical and safeguarding, but because I train up supervisors as well, I often talk about the responsibilities a counsellor or supervisor might have, because we are gatekeepers. I'm thinking as a counsellor, we might be a gatekeeper for a client, to, I don't know, what am I thinking about? Like a mitigating circumstances letter. Like if you work with lots of uni students as clients, eventually they'll come to some point in the year and go, oh Myra, I really need a letter of mitigating circumstances so I can pass my course. All of a sudden that responsibility becomes a privilege, and it becomes a power that we can gatekeep. Equally, as a supervisor, we are gatekeeping all the time with our supervisees, especially if they're trainee counsellors, because we are gatekeeping their ability to, we're monitoring their fitness to practice, we're monitoring their ethical practice, we're monitoring their ability to work with clients, we're monitoring whether they stop working with clients, we do a supervisor's report. So all of a sudden, all of these responsibilities we have in our role become power, because we can now determine whether this supervisee, this counsellor's trainee counsellor, passes their course or not, whether they get to work with clients or not. And if we don't recognise that as a power that we can be oppressive with, we can get pulled into being the oppressor and say to supervisees, actually, you know, I'm going to write a report to your college, actually, you're not ready to work with clients, or I'm not going to pass you on that module or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So you can start to see how, if we're not careful, we can be gatekeepers for our clients and for our counsellors, because we have these privileged identities. So yeah, if you're also a supervisor or in any other role, watch for that kind of gatekeeping power or responsibility as well. I do a whole separate training on supervision, but you know, I do talk about power in supervision as well. So, final 15 minutes. Based on everything we have kind of been talking about today, really now addressing then what are ways in which we can then flatten that power. Before I do the big reveal, any thoughts on what that might now look like based on everything we've spoken about today? Do people have any thoughts on what that might now look like? What are the things you might now consider? I'll stop sharing to come back to the gallery, but based on everything we've heard today, what are you now consciously acknowledging or thinking about that you feel then, oh, I now need to think about this in my work to make it anti-oppressive? Just give you a few moments to kind of capture anything or jot anything down or look back over your notes. But based on everything that we've spoken and discussed today, what are the things you're now bearing in mind? Or what are the things you might want to be aware of, explore, think about, discuss with your client maybe? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I think there's so much, it's difficult to pinpoint one thing. There's so many different layers to it. But just holding in mind, like, the shift, really, the importance of the shift from power as oppressive to anti-oppressive, and just holding that in mind, like, it's not power in and of itself is neutral, but how it can be oppressive. And I think that for me, just really being more so mindful of all the smaller nuanced ways in which our identities and the kind of the societal and historical space in which we exist can impact that.
Yes.
It feels like there's, like we said earlier, that we can think that we can kind of go into this vacuum as counsellors, but actually outside of that, everything is influencing what's happening in that space, and trying to hold that in mind. And also being aware, I think, for me, of what makes me feel disempowered as well. So my experience of powerlessness and looking more at my history of power and how that has played out in my life, and how that might then influence the relationship I have or form with my clients, I think.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So really honouring your awareness of not only that it's present, but also moving it from oppressive to anti-oppressive power, and then how your own blueprint might unconsciously influence you wanting to repeat that or get drawn into it with your clients. Yeah. Oh, those are great things, absolutely, to think about. Yeah, spot on. Yeah. Anyone else?
I think for me, it was because of the different roles and the different sort of roles that I hold. It's the three powers, like, the role power, and the societal power and the historical power, and just keeping that in mind in regards to sort of the different people that I'm working with, because I'll be working with sort of clients, but from a clinical lead perspective, and then from a client, from a counsellor perspective, and the supervisees as well, because all of this and then my students, and to be able to sort of just have that at the back of my mind, knowing that actually there's quite a lot going on within that, all the different nuances of power, and how I'm presenting with my own blueprint, and how they are presenting with their own blueprint, and then you've got the historical power behind it, actually. And from everything that I've sort of done quite recently in my interactions with both students and supervisees, that's been quite strong, to be fair, which is why I found this really sort of exciting and beneficial, because it's so apparent that it's coming through, and it's coming through quite a lot at the moment with the interactions that I'm having with the students and the supervisees that I'm working with.
Yeah. So again, it's really acknowledging it's that combination of all of those. It's not this idea that, oh, I've thought about power, right, let me now think about everything else. It's power is the thread through everything and through all of those layers, and it's that nuance that it's not a tick box that gets done as a bolt on or gets thought about once and you go, what, a job done. Well, that's why we talk about it as relational power. It's a proactive element within the relationships, as you've just said. Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts before I kind of share with you what I have on my list anyway? Just thoughts of ways to rebalance the power. Okay. So let me again go back to the screen share. As I said, for me, these are just my thoughts on how things to be aware of. And as I said, it's not they're not necessarily, how can I put it? It's not about them being proactive, but some of it's about what we are aware of, as I said. So first and foremost for me is that when we're thinking about power, is absolutely to shift away from power as power over and into those other three types of anti-oppressive power. Because by recognizing that we can have power within that personal power, and then there's power between us in relationship, we can absolutely reposition the client then as being responsible and capable, that they have agency and autonomy. At the same time, they can also be in need of help. Because what we get to move away from then is that drama triangle that we are the rescuer or we need to be the dominant counsellor. So for me, and it also moves the client out of a victim position. So essentially, with the drama triangle, we're looking to always escape the triangle or exit it. And this is the way of exiting it. It's moving away from power, seeing power as only as power over, to those other 3 types of anti-oppressive power. And that repositions the client as being responsible, capable, has agency, and also can come to us for support and help. Other ways to rebalance the power include focusing on the client themselves, but by being alongside the client and not in the position of expert. Again, I'm probably speaking to the converted here when I say all of these things in this list, but it's just to be explicit about us being explicit, but also conscious and intentional of us being anti-oppressive. So being alongside, that's that power with, you know, in the relationship. How do we sit alongside them as an equal? So that's very much number 3 of the different types of power. It's to build a positive, supportive therapeutic relationship and alliance so that the client trusts the counsellor and the therapeutic relationship and sees the counsellor as credible. So again, this is about power between or power with. Yeah, really picking up on the idea that in that 3rd out of the 3 types of power, this is a client then who is experiencing somebody else as equal to them, and they themselves are being perceived as equal from the counsellor as well. So this is how we offer power, power between rather. As I've mentioned earlier, be aware of the language we use as the counsellor. Don't use jargon, because this is the flip side of all the privileges. It's not that we get rid of the privileges. It's about recognising how do we utilise those privileges to make them power between or power with. At the same time then, as we are aware of the language we're using, be aware of the language that's used by the client, especially when they're relating their narrative and their story and their experiences. You know, do they speak of oppressive experiences about powerlessness, struggle, or discrimination? Equally, flip side, be aware that if they're using lots of language that really promotes or supports or boosts a position of privilege as well. So being aware of language. So as I said, some of these are not, I don't think any of these are new to any of you, but we're being explicit then about how do we then really utilize that power between us? How do we utilize power within relationships? And these are ways of doing it. Following on from that, just one more slide on ways to rebalance power. So that was kind of slide 1 of this. Slide 2 then is specifically then thinking about anti-oppressive practice. We are then looking at and examining our practice for signs of power and oppression. So whilst we are mindful of what we're doing with the client, it's also within our practice, so within our supervision, in our process notes and within sessions, it's about looking for those signs of power and oppression in how we're showing up, how we're relating to the client, but also how we're even setting up our sessions with the client. You know, going all the way back to how do they experience booking in for an assessment? Well, even before that, how are they accessing us? How are they being navigated through the assessment process? How do they then get allocated to us? All the way through to the actual therapeutic practice, and how do they then experience ending with us? So we can look at all of that entire process through a anti-oppressive lens. Okay. And again, so much of what we've mentioned today is about being aware of then the unconscious relationship of the role of oppressor and oppressed, making sure we don't repeat in here a power over relationship. And of course, that can be through transference, through our relationship blueprints, as we've mentioned today, and also through our own societal power and historical power. How might we be unintentionally repeating an oppressor-oppressed dynamic in here? Of course, then being aware of both your and your client's intersectionality. This goes back to the societal power. Societal power is all about intersectional identity. You know, what power do I hold because society determines that's the power I get? Yeah. Be aware of the powerlessness of your clients. So again, not only based on their relationship blueprint, but also again through their intersectionality. And very specifically then, how is that part of their blueprint that they are, I think, Deb, you mentioned it earlier today, that a client will I say intentionally, but unconsciously maybe, position themselves in the powerless relationship, because that's their place out there. And so they will just want to repeat that in here with you. And certainly that's about them trying to draw you into a drama triangle as well. So that language of powerlessness, that language of being a victim, is a sign of moving into or being drawn into. You're being kind of coerced, maybe, being invited to collude with, and invited to collude with a drama triangle. So again, being mindful of what you're getting drawn into. Of course, then based on blueprints and based on what a client experiences out there, we then of course have to be aware of how a client then may play out their experience of powerlessness in here with us. Often this can be based on that point there, but the several above it in the list. This really is about a client who might present with a lack of autonomy or choice, or unable to hold boundaries, for example, unable to make decisions for themselves. You know, they're presenting as somebody that has very little autonomy or choice. And because of that, then, if we're not careful and we move into a power over position, we of course do harm then to the client and harm to the relationship. And for me, I then talk about this winner's relational triangle, moving away from the drama triangle and instead moving into a winner's relational triangle. So rather than it being power over between victim, perpetrator and rescuer, we're instead moving into a power between dynamic, in which there is an equality of power shared between us, that both people recognize that they hold power within, and that they experience power between themselves as well, that we're equal in this relationship. And for me, then, it's about the qualities of being assertive, nurturing, and vulnerable. And if we can find that in our relationships, we are fostering then a relational power dynamic with our clients that really speaks to those anti-oppressive types of power. You know, numbers 2, 3, and 4, rather than power over, the anti-oppressive power. Okay. So as I said, I mean, in going through these two last slides, for me anyway, none of this is new at 4:30 this afternoon. This is what we've been speaking about all day. So hopefully these slides are a overview of how we've been thinking about power in the work, and actually what we can do to move into utilizing the power within, power between, and power to. You know, those 3 types of anti-oppressive power. Like I said, a lot of this is not about it being explicit or conscious or in dialogue with your client. All of this is about our internal process, about how we're showing up and how we are choosing to position ourselves in relationship with the client. Okay. And of course, if you do work with the in-here or the immediacy of the in-here relationship, it of course also can be talked about. It's not purely an internal process, but it can also come up in the work explicitly as well, if that is part of your work with your client. So I often talk about that, you know, the in-here with my clients, and a lot of this does come into it, because for them it's about, again, it's not about going, I'm going to empower you. It's about, well, how do you feel in relationship with me? How are you feeling or experiencing? How do you experience relationships? Do you experience power or powerlessness? Do you experience being pushed, rejected, abandoned, pushed away? Any of those words, they're very common points of maximum pain for clients. So when they're talking about abandonment or rejection, how does that fit in with experiences of powerlessness? So it's there in the room anyway. Maybe what we've done today is put language to it. Okay. I'm mindful of the time. We're kind of on time, really, to end there for today. I will come back to gallery in one second. I just want to point out a couple of highlights to you, if you're not already aware. The book itself, which this training is based upon, is available. If you are interested to get a copy for yourself, there is a 20% off code there directly from the publishers. It will be in the slide anyway, if you don't have the link jotted down. And what I want to do a quick plug that what I'm doing starting in January is some brand new anti-oppressive supervision groups. So this is, there are a block of 6 monthly sessions. So starting in January through to June. So it's a 2-hour space every month. So there are 2 groups, one on a Monday morning and one on a Wednesday evening. And essentially, this is offered as secondary supervision, like supportive supervision, additional to your primary supervision. If you're wanting to really look at your work through an anti-oppressive lens, or starting to really utilise this in your practice. Okay. Details of this are on my website. It says there are only 3 spaces left, but of course, since this went out a few days ago, spaces have gone. So actually, all I've got left are 2 spaces on the Wednesday night. So if you're interested, then please do ping me over an email. But as I said, it's offered as secondary supervision, but I really appreciate that for a lot of people, they're really wanting to kind of sit in their, or look at their clinical material and their client work through the lens that we've been thinking about today. So if any of that has interested you, and you want to be part of one of the well, there's only space on the Wednesday group, but if you want to be part of the Wednesday group, then please do ping me over an email. But equally, I will be offering supervision groups for later in the year as well, if it doesn't appeal to you for January. Okay, sorry, just a bit quick plug from me at the end before I forget. I'm looking at the time, and I know that we do need to end, but just to check in, and as well as check out with people. Give yourselves maybe a minute or so just to capture any thoughts or reflections, or just what you're sat with maybe at the end of today. And I'll invite people maybe to then share as a checkout one word or one thing, whether it's in one word or a sentence, one thing that you're taking with you from today, or the one thing that's percolating maybe. It could be one word or a sentence, but however you want to check out in terms of what you're thinking about or taking with you.
It feels quite hopeful for me to be able to think that we're all here today, and that we're making that shift. Yeah, so I feel hopeful and inspired as well. I feel like it's just so important. Yeah, and thank you very much. It's been great.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thank you. As I said, the congratulations goes to all of you for being open to engage in this, because it is something new and challenging to the status quo. So thank you for all developing as anti-oppressive practitioners.
I think for me, it's more like affirming, because it's helped explicitly put in a framework things that have sort of been like circulating around and creeping in, and it's sort of been quite instinctive, but actually it's been really nice to have it as a model. I like models. So yeah, thank you for that. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I don't, in my head, I always think, I don't think I necessarily teach anything new. I think I just teach it in a way that just helps people to understand it. And yeah, I teach it based on how my brain works, which is frameworks and diagrams and visuals and metaphors.
I think from me, the biggest thing that I'm perhaps going to take away is looking at how my own experience of power and my own relationship blueprints and all of those sorts of things impact the way I do my role, and how that might impact decisions I'm making, and the way I'm interacting with people, and what I can just being mindful of that and recognizing that going forward.
Thank you, Deborah.
For me, I think I would echo a bit of what everyone's just said, but also just being more explicitly aware of those 4 different types of power, and when maybe slipping into that oppressive role versus being more anti-oppressive, and just, really being proactive about considering that more.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately the thing with being anti-oppressive practitioners, which is we have to live and breathe it consciously and explicitly, because the moment we don't, the way that society is shaped through structural and systemic oppression is only going to, a bit like the drama triangle, will draw us back into those old ways of relating. So it's a very intentional piece to be offering anti-oppressive practice and to be an anti-oppressive practitioner in any role that we do, whether that's CEO, counsellor, supervisor, tutor, any role. So I'm grateful, as I said earlier, that all of you have come to this space to want to make that intentional switch, because it is going against the thing that has been perceived as normative within our profession for all of these years. So thank you all so much for coming today. I appreciate a long day, heavy day, lots to think about, lots to go away now and digest on. As I said, on Monday, I'm going to send through to you the video links, the PDF of the slides, feedback forms, and also, like a Brucey bonus, which I forgot to mention at the start, your CPD certificate, which of course you don't want to not have. So I will also email those to you on Monday as well. Okay. If anybody has any follow-up questions or just wants to check anything out with me, please do feel free to reach out and email me. And if any of this has interested you more, as I said, please check out my website for all the upcoming trainings and workshops that I'm doing, including potentially going into next year, larger, longer, more in-depth trainings that I'm going to be offering as well. So if any of this has interested you, then please watch out for what's coming in 2024, hopefully. Okay. So yeah, just leaves me to say thank you all so much. You'll deserve a nice, peaceful, restful evening, I hope. Or either way, nice and restful, or either a big out evening, whatever floats your boat in terms of needing something after a day sitting in front of the computer. So whatever it is you're choosing to do, I hope you enjoy it. You deserve it. And thank you all so much for being in a space that has been and is what has felt like incredibly safe and supportive to everybody. So I really appreciate that any space that I facilitate brings together people that come here for the common good and with good intentions. So thank you all so much. Okay, leave it there for now, and as I said, I'll email you all on Monday.
Thanks very much.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.